understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and today we're just going to have a very, very special conversation. It's not every day you get the chance to talk to a Nobel Prize winner of anything, let alone economics. But today I'm going to be talking to Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner. And it seems to me, John, like this week you have Biden with that disastrous performance last week.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You have Trump cock of the hoop. You have the French elections changing the dynamic there. You have all sorts of things happening. And it kind of feels that the world is kind of slightly spun off on a weird axis, doesn't it?
Well, I think I was saying this to you before, that I've been feeling that for the past year. My anxiety is rising with all this stuff. And it's all pointing towards November. And, you know, when is it 4th or the 6th or whatever it is in November?
6th, because Kilconomics is the day after it. It's the day after Trump. Right. It's the day after.
Well, at least it'd be something to talk about.
There'll be loads to talk about. Yeah,
talking points
but both. So basically, what you have is you've got two lads here sitting down in the HQ in the basement, anxious,
yes,
wiggy and anxious and nervous, looking for secret stashes of Xanax to just keep us on the straight and narrow. So the great thing is we'll talk to Joe Stiglitz, because he's just written this new book, and he's a wonderful academic. A very interesting story as well about meeting him many years ago.
Yeah.
But the book is called The Road to Freedom, and it's called Economics and the Good Society. Just again, it's something.
That sounds kind of positive.
Yeah, it does.
It kind of goes against the grain little
of the dismal science. Oh no, he's very, very. So let's go over to the States and talk to Joe Stiglitz. Now, this is a man who actually changed my career path, and I'll give you the story, and I'll see does Joe remember it. Okay, it is the 10th of May, 1991. And I am an economist in the Central Bank of Ireland. And Joe Stiglitz is the rock and roll economist. He comes over from California to give the keynote address to the Irish Economic Association in Carrickmacross, of all places. And during that afternoon, Joe says, Northern Ireland's very close, isn't it? It's just over the border. This is when Northern Ireland the border was absolutely 100% fortified. And we said, yeah, Crossmaglen is across the border. Now, anybody who knows Crossmaglen will know in those days, Crossmaglen was known as, maybe unfairly, the capital of bandit country. And we went into a bar called Keenan's Bar, right? Myself, Joe Stiglitz, and we discussed this paper. And John here was listening to me before, and the paper was Towards a Reformulation of Monetary Theory. Okay. And it opened with this, and this is the most important thing, Joe, right? It opened, I was a young economist. I couldn't understand why economists believed all this nonsense of neoclassical economics. So the world wasn't working like that. And the paper opens with, neoclassical economics is a difficult subject. It requires more than the usual willingness to suspend one's disbelief. And I said to myself, I need to listen to this guy. And I was 22 or 23. I was just out of college, and I badgered you. And I think you were so charming and so nice. You said, okay, I'll sit down with this young fella and I'll explain the way the world works. And it really changed my career, Joe. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I remember it, and it was, I remember the paper. I thought, an important paper, and I really enjoyed that visit.
Well, do you remember the little bar, Keenan's Bar in Crossmaglen? Now, we were all kind of a bit worried. You were blasé. You were like, yeah, cool, I'll go and have a pint of Guinness, sit down and chew the cud with a couple of young fellas. It was great. So, and then, since then, obviously, you've gone on to do all sorts of things, not just winning the Nobel Prize for economics, but the head of the Economic Advisors Council in Clinton, head chief economist of the World Bank. We can go on and on and on, Joe. All these extraordinary accolades to be at the top of the game. But you had time for a young fella who was just starting the game. So thank you so much. Let's kick off. You've got a new book out called The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. First of all, that's a beautiful title, and it actually gives me hope. Tell me where the title comes from.
Well, one of the major theses of the book is that neoliberalism was a set of policy prescriptions based on neoclassical economics, had not delivered its promise in terms of economic performance. But the promise of that had been made was even greater. People like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman had said free enterprise, free markets were not only necessary for economic efficiency, they were necessary for political freedom. Hayek, writing in 1944, as the world was recovering from the Great Depression, Keynesian ideas were being discussed. Scandinavia was moving to the welfare state. Already in it, the UK was discussing it and would adopt National Health Service shortly. Hayek was so worried that this expansion of government, we take it for granted today that expansion to maintain the economy on a stable path, that this expansion of the economy was taking us down the road to serfdom.
Yes.
And that was the title of his book, The Road to Serfdom. I wanted to contrast that view by writing a book, The Road to Freedom. How do we get real freedom for most people, for our society? And so I wanted to write a contrast to what he did and to say he got it exactly wrong. Milton Friedman gotten it wrong, and they had not appreciated the meaning of freedom and how you go about getting it.
Okay, well, I want to go back to the book. I want to go back to the notion of freedom. But the great thing about you, Joe, is that for all of us who were trying to figure out when we were kids doing economics, was there a standard bearer in the academic world who had the mathematical heft, let's say, the rigor, had the theoretical rigor, but was basically saying, hold on a second, you see the emperor there? He's got no clothes on. Right? Which is basically, you're saying this about the neoliberals and the neocons and all these sort of things. So can I just go back and get a flavor of Joe Stiglitz before he became Joe Stiglitz? Is your background, how does that inform? Because when you write about economics, Joe, you write incredibly humanely. It almost looks as if you're writing from the heart, leavened with the head, but writing from the heart. So I've always wanted to know, how come you arrived at these very liberal, very caring, I would say very generous view of the economy?
I mean, it obviously had a lot to do with my growing up. Gary, Indiana, steel town. I was later to find out the golden age of capitalism. I didn't think of it that way because what I saw was a lot of inequality, a lot of racial segregation, discrimination. The nature of industrial economy in the 50s, which is the peak, was bad labor relations and the economy going up and down all the time, classmates without any money to spend. I mean, it wasn't that kind of pretty picture that when a little later I went to graduate school, I was told, well, the economy is perfectly efficient.
You were like, no.
I say, this is not the economy that I knew. No one was interested in inequality.
It kind of sounds dumb now, doesn't it? It sounds so mad now when you think about it.
Nobody talked about it. Now, I did spend and shaping my intellectual journey after 2 years at MIT as a PhD student. I said, I want to hear from the other side. And so I got a Fulbright, went to Cambridge, UK, where there were a number of people on the other side.
Yep.
Joan Robinson, Nikki Caldor. And what was interesting about them at that time is there were people who were very interested in distribution, like David Champernoun. There are many of the people who were most critical of neoclassical, didn't really understand it. So I got a lot of the earful of the critics. And then one of the things that I wanted to do is say, well, some of what has motivated their criticism is right, but their analytics weren't up
to scratch.
Yeah. And that was a clear agenda for me to try to fix that.
Yeah, I mean, it's when I first came across your stuff, John hears it's like two economists going off about economics, John. But John's like, yeah, whatever.
No, go for it, lads, go for it.
No. But Joe, can I Can I ask you, what was it like? So you're a top academic, and you moved then into Clinton's White House as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the 1990s. What was that transition like? What was it like? What was it like working in the front line of policymaking? And what was Clinton like to work with?
Well, for Clinton was very interesting to work with. He had appointed a lot of first-rate people. Our discussions were really very interesting. What one understood in the end is that there were a lot of decisions that were made not based on economic analysis. Political power mattered.
Yeah.
And that was very influential in my later thinking that, I became much more aware of the notion of power. Competitive markets that are the cornerstone of neoclassical economics say nobody has power.
Yeah.
Now, that was one of the things that I always found strange, because firms do have market power. They may not have unfettered power, but they do have enormous power, much more power than an ordinary individual has. And so it gave me an introduction to power and the role of money in politics. It also gave me a little better idea of the way that academic economics serves and doesn't serve public policy. And when I say that, it gives us a lot of ideas that helps shape it. When we come to a new problem, it gives us an intellectual framework. At the same time, some of those ideas, like markets are perfectly competitive, handcuff us or blindfold us in dealing with important problems where those assumptions are so far from reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
That if you adopt prescriptions based on those assumptions, you're going to go in the wrong direction. And finally, there were so many instances where the complexity of the real world necessitated bringing in many strands of thought. And academia tends to go down a narrow lane.
Yeah.
And doesn't train individuals to go across borders, you might say, and cross lanes and formulate policies that are adequate to the task. I mean, example where it really hit me is, may sound a little bit arcane, but we have a lot of toxic waste sites. And what you do with them is a real problem. And figuring out the right legal framework, the right incentive structures involved law and economics in ways that I hadn't seen dealt with in the academic literature.
It's always lovely to listen to somebody talk about adjusting and adapting on an ongoing basis during your career. Like you face new problems. You're at the World Bank, there's a whole different set of problems. You're at the Clinton administration, there's a whole different set of problems, and you're just adjusting and adapting. It shows us sort of an openness to learning that many economists unfortunately don't have. They arrive at, it's like Moses has given us the tablets, and these are the rules of the game, and that's the way the world works. And there's no adjusting.
That's right, and particularly, when I went on to the World Bank, it was even more so because I knew America, I knew the United States, and so I had a sense of the U.S. economy. I spent some time in Africa and Kenya, and over the years, time in a number of other countries, but not really embedded in the way I was. So becoming a chief economist of the World Bank necessitated spending a lot of time in a lot of countries that were very, very different. The first country I went to was Ethiopia. And it was also the last country I went to in my tour as chief economist. And I developed a real rapport with the prime minister and, really became very engaged in a new set of economic problems that they faced.
I mean, the thing about, if we even go to East Africa, just a little detour, it is a fascinating, fast-growing incredibly demographically vibrant part of the world. Kenya, Ethiopia, that part of the world, do you see, like with your economics hat on, but your global hat on, do you see those countries growing rapidly over the course of the next couple of years? And how will that change the world?
Their demography, their population is growing rapidly. In fact, almost all of the growth in the workforce of the world will occur in Africa. And there will be real migration problems if we don't succeed in closing the gap in incomes between Africa and the rest of the world, the advanced countries. Now, unfortunately, in the past, the advanced countries, Europe and the United States, have really seen too much of Africa as just a source of natural resources. They've taken from Africa commodities, resources, but haven't given back in kind. The question of our mining companies, how cheap can I get it?
Yeah.
How little can I give them for these enormously valuable resources? So a lot of huge fortunes in US and Europe are based on Africa. That money belonged to the Africans.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It was their resource. Now, where it will go will also depend on politics. My experiences led me to say how close economics and politics are so intertwined. And Ethiopia is an example. Under Meles, it grew at 12% a year.
Yeah.
Now they're in a state of virtual civil war, and the economy is in basically stagnant decline. It's a totally different story from what happened. And for the more than decade that he was the prime minister, he managed to keep things together. But when he died, things fell apart. So politics is really important. And that comes, of course, back to the US in a way.
Well, let's go back to the US. So we have elections in France. We have elections in Britain. We have a Biden performance in the United States, which is clearly worrying all the Democrats. Where do you think the United States, your own country, is going?
I think one can't answer that question. It is obviously very worrying that neoliberalism, neoclassical economics didn't work. And there are a lot of unhappy people. And unfortunately, but predictably, in fact, I wrote and said this was creating a fertile field for a demagogue. One never can predict the form in which a demagogue will take. America was very unlucky, I think, in having it take the form of Donald Trump. And it's gone, like many demagogues, into ways of blaming immigrants, blaming unfair trade deals, blaming everybody except ourselves. We made a bad choice in economic policy. And under Trump, we're about to make, if he were elected, we would be making even worse choices. I looked at his program, looked at, where it will lead us, more inflation, lower GDP, everything, every indicator would be worse. What is even more worrisome that links with my book is that he has no sense of freedom, no sense of what I call the Enlightenment project was about, which was tolerance, science, and social organization that allows us to cooperate together to do more than what we could as an individual. And none of us could do any, I couldn't even feed myself on it, but we cooperate in social organization. And we've developed complex political and economic organizations that serve our society and give us a lot of freedom. And when freedom, I mean freedom to do, freedom to realize ourselves in so many ways. And because he doesn't understand what that means, we are at risk of losing all that.
I mean, it's very interesting to me the way you define freedom, because when I was growing up and studying economics and reading economics, there was a sort of a shorthand that freedom was your freedom to be left alone, be on your own, just freedom to, what you're saying is, no, freedom isn't the freedom to be left alone. You're saying freedom is something quite different. Explain to me the Stiglitz version of freedom and how people like Trump are moving against that and how you can get back on course, how the United States could get back on course.
Is what you're free to do, what you can do. And there are several basic ideas here. Let me begin with a very simple one. If you're an individual who is at the point of starvation, has no freedom.
Yeah.
He does what he has to do to survive. So you can think of that as zero freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Again, and the second idea is that one person's freedom can impinge on that of another. I put it, one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. Or as Isaiah Berlin put it, freedom for the wolves is death for the sheep.
It's pretty good.
And that's the issue we face all the time. Freedom for the gun owners is death to the people who are being killed in America and the mass murders that we have. And if a rational society would balance those and say, what's more important, the freedom to carry an AK-47 down the street in New York or the freedom not to be killed in a mass murder? I think most of our societies would say,
we'd go for the latter.
Freedom to live is more important, right?
Yeah.
So that's the second idea. And the third idea is that sometimes some restrictions can expand the freedom of everybody. Let me illustrate. Take a stoplight, busy intersection. Without stoplights, nobody can move. You have gridlock.
Yep.
Nobody has freedom in the sense of what they can do. Now you put a stoplight. Now, the stoplight impinges my freedom. I can't go until it's my turn. But without the stoplight, no one could go.
Exactly.
So everybody's freedom is increased by having a simple regulation. And that basic idea is very broad. We don't think of it that way. It's just an example of let me give you another example in this framework. We might not be here talking today if the government hadn't developed the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines.
That's true.
We have a freedom to be able to talk.
Yeah.
And if without that, we would not have freedom. And we could not have had that mRNA vaccine without taxes that funded the research that developed the vaccine and the platform for the vaccine. So collectively, we are restrained. I had to give up some of my money. Am I glad? Giving up a little money so I can live expands my freedom in a meaningful sense.
And so in your view, so the United States has kind of gone off on a misunderstanding of the notion of freedom based on individual liberty, but in a very libertarian way. And in a way, you just have to the States has to try and get back on track. But it doesn't look like that, Joe.
I think the country's divided. And so let me give you the optimistic, and then I in the end, I have to say the country's divided. It is. The young people I talk to, just like the young people in France, are very much on my wavelength.
Mm-hmm.
They want to expand freedom in a meaningful sense. They want somehow a sense of social solidarity, willing to pay taxes if it means that society is better off. So a significant fraction of the young people are more progressive than they've ever been.
No, absolutely. It's interesting. You're talking about demographics there. Tony Benn, the old English socialist, I interviewed him many, many years ago. And he said something very interesting. He said, a young man, he said, you have to appreciate one thing. And I said, what is this, Mr. Benn? He says, that the young and the old have something in common. And I said, what's that? He says, we're both bullied by the middle-aged. And I thought it was a really interesting way of looking at the world.
Well, I think partly age is important. Also, the country is divided, rural, urban, educated, uneducated. So we have so many divisions in our society right now that when you ask, where is America going? I don't think anybody can tell you. I'm hopeful that the Enlightenment project stays alive in America. That the idea that science, we can learn about nature, that we can think, deliberate, how do we organize ourselves, that we can have discussions about, I try to be very deliberate in my book, not saying what the answers are as you make those trade-offs. Some cases, I think they're pretty obvious, but many cases, I say they're really difficult decisions, trade-offs.
Yeah.
Zoning how you structure cities is a really difficult one as an example of the difficulty.
Yeah, we're having exactly that issue in Ireland. We have exactly that issue. It's like, how do you zone? How do you create enough houses for people, particularly younger people? How do you make sure that people aren't leaving the country, which they are in significant numbers in Ireland, because they can't get a house? It's not because the country's not working. It's because actually this part isn't working and they're leaving.
That's right. And it's impinging on some people's freedom to have a neighbor, to lose a park. And the question is, how do you structure a city? It's a context where we often come together because we have to figure out how do we make these trade-offs, which are very difficult.
Well, I think, Joe, what I would love to do is at one stage to have you in front of an audience, an Irish audience, to tease out all, because a book called The Road to Freedom, it's deliberate and it's engaging. And also this idea, the idea of a good society. Because I think that far too few economists think about the good society. Even the notion of the good society is not something that you hear in universities at all, at any great level of deliberation.
Right. And part of the reason is, economics for almost 100 years has tried to avoid thinking about this at all, because it just says people are born with what they want, what they are, how they are, and we just have to maximize welfare given those beliefs, those preferences. And as you know, David, we talk about Pareto efficiency, where you can maximize the well-being of one person subject to the level of utility and welfare of everybody else. And economists tend to say, well, distribution is beyond economics. That's a question of moral philosophy. And good society is a question beyond economics. That's beginning to change because of a branch of economics that I've been involved in and helped promote, which is called behavioral economics. Mm-hmm. And the new work in behavioral economics the last 20 years has emphasized that we don't come into the world fully formed, and we change over time. We change with our experiences. As parents, we think that that's one of our jobs is to change our children from being beast into human civilized people.
Some of us are doing that better than others, I can tell you.
So once you begin to say, well, people are shaped and our society shapes us, because the most important influence on each of us is our society. We shape society, but society shapes us. You can't help escape the question of what is a good society. You want to know, we all have our views, people who think about others, honest, work hard. We have a whole set of, engaged with other people.
Of attributes, of characteristics that you want to
attributes
promote.
And characteristics. And what economics traditionally has failed to consider is that capitalism shapes the people in our society. It shapes us to be selfish, dishonest. We are not, fortunately, a perfectly capitalistic society. We all belong, have churches, have schools, community groups, friendships. So fortunately, but ruthless capitalism says the only thing that matters is money, greed. That's not a good society.
No, and actually, when you look at it, most humans are motivated by a whole host of other things. Friendship, decency, honesty. When you really bring it down, people are motivated undoubtedly by wealth and money, but that's only part of the story.
It's a small part of the story. You need it at a certain level, but most of the people I know are not motivated by them. And the people who are motivated tend to be unhappy.
Yeah, exactly.
But the point I wanted to raise, though, is that once we recognize that our economic system shapes who we are, we have to ask the question, which is the second part of the title of the book, Economics and the Good Society. What kind of economic system will promote the kind of society that we think we would like to have?
Well, we could discuss this all day. This conversation in my head started in Keenan's bar in Crossmaglen on the 10th of May, 1991. And it's been going on and on. Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Love talking to you. I'm looking forward to come to Ireland.
Now, John, could you imagine the two of us, the two economists, the old and the young economists sitting in the back of Keenan's bar,
I see
Crossmaglen, with the whirl of British Apache helicopters all around.
I say there was a few hairy eyeballs on you as well.
It was very interesting because you walk into a bar and again, that part of the country, South Armagh, in those days was very, very much an us and them.
Yeah.
And I turn up with this sort of American liberal economists. A couple of pints, please, there. And the fellas, of course, were looking and said, who are these lads?
How's about you?
It was exactly, how's about you? It was like, who are these lads? And then it was it was so odd. And we were actually talking about his paper on the reformulation of monetary policy.
I was like, what are you talking about? Well, actually, what we're talking about is a really interesting paper on the reformulation
of monetary policy. Anyway, so that was Joe Stiglitz, a wonderful, wonderful man.
I thought it was really interesting just the way he put freedom and what freedom is.
That's the idea.
And a different take on freedom, which something I've always felt, but he just put it beautifully.
Yeah,
there,
no,
about
sure.
the wolf and the sheep.
Yeah, well, that's Isaiah Berlin, who was also
traffic lights.
Yeah, traffic lights. But that idea is that we have been swept up with this idea is that freedom and liberty is the liberty to be left alone, right? Away from the government, not interfering. But what he's saying is, no. Freedom is actually about opportunity.
Yeah.
Right? And if you are, and you notice this, I was down the West this week, and what you notice, like in Connemara, the kind of slightly haunting sense of Connemara I always get. You're much more aware of the famine and things like that when you're there than you are up there. Because obviously that's where the vast majority of people died, was in Connemara. And in fact, there's a very Star of the Sea, Joseph O'Connor's book. If you ever read that, it's amazingly evocative of that period, right? But, that's what Stiglitz is saying, is that when you're starving, you've no freedom. You got to start with these basic ideas, and then build from there. And again, it's also a little dig at Hayek as well, because Hayek was this idea of the road to serfdom, where he thought that we were all going to become socialists, and we'd all become serfs.
But it's that idea as well of neoliberalism. I always find that, when you take neoliberalism to the nth degree and stuff, you end up with gated communities, which is the opposite of freedom.
Completely, you're absolutely right. And I've noticed it if you actually go to either South Africa, Argentina, I noticed that.
Yeah.
Where the middle class are holed up behind walls.
Yeah.
Looking very like Crossmaglen in 1991, with a big army base right in the middle of it. No, but it's interesting. So again, for me, I know it was a little bit economic-y.
No, it was good. I loved it.
The opportunity to talk to one of the big brains in the game is always something that I find amazing. And the fascinating thing about Stiglitz was even when he was young and he was an economic, I know you might find rock and roll superstar economics. I know you find it hard to get your head.
This is very nerds out.
No, but on the academic stuff, so he's really, really brilliant at maths, right? And he could explain things so easily, and so brilliantly. And that idea, you're sitting in the back of a bar and it's, you're talking to, it's like talking to Elvis for you. Anyway, we'll let it go. Talk to you next week.